This war is not real, at least not in the way you think. The missiles are real, the destruction is real, the deaths are real, but the reason behind it all, that might be the greatest illusion ever created. Because what if the conflict between the United States and Iran is not about oil, not about religion, not even about power? What if it is about controlling something far more fundamental, your perception of reality itself? And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand this, we have to step outside the present and look at a much older idea. Imagine this. You are born inside a dark cave. You are not alone. Millions sit beside you. All of you are chained. You cannot move. You cannot turn your head. You cannot leave. In front of you, there is only a wall. At first, it is empty. Then shadows begin to appear. You do not know where they come from. You have never seen anything else. So you begin to believe they are real. You give them names. You build language around them. You create stories. And over time, those shadows become everything. They become truth. They become reality. But behind you, there is a fire. And between you and that fire are unseen figures. They move objects in front of the flame, and those objects cast the shadows you see. They do not need to control you directly. They only need to control what you see. Because once perception is controlled, reality follows. This is the first truth. Reality is not something we simply observe. It is something we construct together. Now bring this idea into the modern world. Think about how value is created, not just through labor or resources, but through attention. If someone creates something with full focus and intention, it becomes valuable. If they are distracted, it loses value. The difference is not the material, it is consciousness. Attention is the hidden currency of our world. And wherever attention flows, value follows. Scale this up. Entire systems are built to capture your attention. Money becomes more than currency. It becomes a container for human focus, a way to extract and redistribute the awareness of billions. And suddenly the shadows are no longer abstract. They are markets, they are narratives, they are beliefs about power and truth. But here is where it becomes dangerous. The system does not force you to believe in it. It does not need to. Because once enough people accept the illusion, they begin to protect it themselves. Power does not come from force. It comes from belief in force. And the final truth is this. Even when the illusion is exposed, most people will reject reality to defend it. Because the illusion gives them meaning, identity, stability, and anything that threatens it becomes an enemy. So when we ask why wars begin, we look at politics, strategy, and history. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper conflict. A struggle over perception. A battle over which version of reality the world will accept. And once you see the world this way, the war between nations looks very different. Because it is no longer just a conflict between countries. It is a conflict between competing illusions. And the real question is not who wins on the battlefield. The real question is whose reality survives. If reality is constructed, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who is constructing it? Because illusions at this scale do not maintain themselves. They require structure. They require systems. They require design. And once you start looking for that structure, you begin to see it everywhere, hidden in plain sight. The modern world is not random. It is organized, layered, engineered to guide how attention flows. And at the center of this system is something most people never question, the global financial order. On the surface, it looks simple. Countries trade, currencies move, markets rise and fall. But underneath that surface is a deeper architecture, one that determines who creates value and who extracts it. At the top of this structure sits a network of institutions, central banks, international organizations, financial authorities that do not belong to any one nation, but influence all of them. They do not need to control governments directly because they control something more powerful, the rules of the game itself. And the game is the global economy. Every time goods are traded, every time money moves across borders, every time a nation grows or collapses, it is happening within a system that was already designed. A system with incentives, with hierarchies, with invisible boundaries. And at the center of it all is one mechanism, the US dollar, not just a currency, but the primary tool for storing and transferring global value. When the world uses it, it is not just participating in trade. It is participating in a system that channels value in specific directions, quietly, consistently, at scale. But the system does not stop there, because it is not enough to create a game. You also need to define how players win. And this is where the hierarchy emerges. At the bottom are raw resources, oil, minerals, agriculture, the physical foundation of civilization. Above that is manufacturing, turning resources into products. Above that is knowledge, technology, research, intellectual property. And at the very top, finance. The layer that does not create value directly, but controls how value is measured, distributed, and multiplied. This hierarchy shapes the entire world. Countries are not just nations, they become roles within the system. Some extract resources, some manufacture goods, some produce knowledge, and some control capital. And once those roles are established, the flow of value becomes predictable, structured, difficult to escape. But here is the key insight. This system does not present itself as a system. It presents itself as reality, as natural, as fair, as the way the world simply works, which is why most people never question it. They are not forced to participate, they choose to, because from inside the system, there appears to be no alternative. And this is what makes it so powerful. It is not just an economic structure, it is a perception, a belief that this is the only possible world. But that belief is starting to crack, because not every country benefits equally. Some are locked at the bottom, some are excluded entirely, and others are beginning to challenge the rules, not by stepping outside the system, but by trying to reshape it. And that is where tension begins to rise. Because once the rules are questioned, the illusion becomes unstable. And when the illusion becomes unstable, the system has only two choices: adapt or defend itself. And history shows us which path it usually takes. Because when a system built on perception is threatened, it does not negotiate first. It reacts, and sometimes it reacts with war. But a system like this cannot survive on structure alone. Rules and hierarchies are not enough, because even the most powerful system will collapse the moment people stop believing in it. So the question becomes, how do you make billions of people believe? Not just once, but continuously across generations. The answer is not force. It is something far more subtle: indoctrination. Not in the obvious sense, not through direct control, but through shaping how people see the world from the very beginning, and this is where the real machinery of control begins. There are three primary channels: education, media, and culture. At first glance, they appear separate, independent, even neutral. But together, they form something far more powerful. A system that defines what is normal, what is true, and what is possible. Start with education. From the moment you enter school, you are taught how the world works. You learn history, economics, politics. But what you are really learning is something deeper. What to accept without questioning. Which systems are legitimate? Which ideas are considered reasonable? And which ones are not? You are not just being taught information. You are being trained to interpret reality in a specific way, a way that aligns with the existing system. Then comes media news platforms, articles, broadcasts. They present themselves as sources of information, but information is never neutral. It is framed, selected, filtered. Certain narratives are repeated, certain perspectives are amplified, others are ignored. And over time, repetition becomes truth. Not because it is accurate, but because it is familiar. And finally, culture. The most invisible layer of all movies, music, entertainment. The stories you consume every day, they shape your desires, your expectations, your sense of identity. They tell you what success looks like, what happiness looks like, what a meaningful life should be. And without realizing it, you begin to chase those images, you measure yourself against them, you internalize them. Together, these three forces do something remarkable. They create alignment, not through coercion, but through consensus. People begin to see the world the same way, think the same way, react the same way. And once that alignment is established, the system no longer needs to enforce itself because people enforce it for each other. This is the hidden power of the cave. The prisoners do not need guards. They guard themselves. Anyone who questions the system becomes a threat, not because they are dangerous, but because they disrupt the shared illusion. And when that illusion is threatened, people react, they reject, they attack, not out of malice, but out of fear, because if the system is not real, then everything built on top of it becomes uncertain, and that is a risk most people are unwilling to take, so they defend it, even if it limits them, even if it controls them, even if it is not entirely true. And this is what makes the system so resilient. It does not rely on force, it relies on belief. But every system built on belief has a weakness, because belief can change. And when enough people begin to question, when enough cracks begin to form, the illusion starts to destabilize. At first, slowly, then all at once. And that is when the system enters its most dangerous phase, because it must now protect itself, not just through narratives, but through action. And that is where we begin to see the cracks appear on the global stage. Conflicts that seem political, but are actually structural wars, that look strategic, but are actually existential. Because what is being protected is no longer just territory, it is the illusion itself. And once that illusion is threatened, everything becomes unstable. Every system built on illusion carries within it a hidden flaw. It must constantly prove that it is real. Because the moment people begin to doubt it, the entire structure starts to weaken. And this is the fundamental problem at the heart of the global order. It depends on perception, specifically one perception above all others, that the system cannot be challenged, that it is permanent, that it is inevitable. At the center of that perception is power, and more specifically, the image of power. Because it is not enough for a system to be strong, it must appear unbeatable. And for decades, that role has been played by a single force, the American empire, not just as a country, but as a symbol of military dominance, economic control, and global authority. But here is the paradox. The empire does not need to control everything directly. It only needs the world to believe that it could at any moment, and that belief creates compliance. Nations align, markets adjust. Leaders calculate their moves based on that assumption. But belief is fragile, and once it begins to crack, the system enters a dangerous phase, because now the illusion must be defended, not just maintained. And this is where history starts to look different. Conflicts that seem irrational, wars that appear unnecessary, interventions that feel disconnected from clear goals. They begin to reveal a pattern. They are not always about winning, they are about demonstrating, sending a message, reinforcing the image of dominance. Like a schoolyard dynamic where the strongest figure must occasionally act, not because it is required, but because it is expected to remind everyone of their position. And over the past decades, we have seen this pattern repeat in regions across the Middle East, in conflicts that reshape entire nations, not always with clear outcomes, but with clear signals. The message is simple, the system still holds. The illusion remains intact. But not everyone accepts this reality. Some nations operate within the system, even if it disadvantages them, because participation still offers benefits. Others begin to question it, push against it, test its limits. And then there are those who are excluded entirely, locked out of the system, denied access to its benefits, forced to operate on the outside. And from that position, they begin to see the system differently, not as reality, but as a structure that can be challenged. And this is where the tension escalates. Because once a nation no longer believes in the system, it no longer follows its rules. And that creates instability. Russia begins to push back, not just militarily, but structurally, challenging the balance of power testing. Whether the system can still enforce its own logic. And the response is immediate. Because if one challenge succeeds, it opens the door for others, which brings us to Iran. Unlike others, Iran is not fully integrated into the system. It does not benefit from the global structure in the same way. And because of that, it has less to lose and more to gain from disruption. But it cannot confront the system directly. The imbalance is too great. So instead, it looks for pressure points, weaknesses within the structure itself. And it finds one, the global economy, the interconnected network that holds everything together. Because if that network is disrupted, even slightly, the effects ripple outward across nations, across markets, across the entire system. And that is the strategy, not direct confrontation, but structural disruption, not attacking power, but attacking the foundation that supports it. Because once the foundation cracks, the illusion begins to collapse. And this is why the conflict cannot easily end, because both sides are no longer fighting for territory. They are fighting for something far more fundamental, the stability of the system itself. And when a system built on perception is pushed to its limits, it does not quietly adapt. It reacts. It escalates. Because survival is no longer optional. It becomes necessary. And that is when conflicts stop being temporary and start becoming inevitable. But systems do not operate on their own. They require actors, individuals who move between layers, who connect finance to politics, politics to intelligence, intelligence to global events. And most of the time, these individuals remain invisible, not because they are hidden, but because no one is looking for them. We are trained to see presidents, prime ministers, public leaders, but real influence often flows through a different network, one that does not belong to any single country, a transnational layer of power where borders matter less than connections, and where influence is measured not by position, but by access. This is where figures like Jeffrey Epstein begin to make more sense, not as isolated anomalies, but as examples of a broader pattern. Individuals who move across worlds, finance, academia, politics, intelligence, seemingly unrelated domains, but deeply interconnected. At first glance, their presence in these spaces feels strange, even suspicious. But from another perspective, it is exactly what the system requires. Bridges people who can navigate different layers of power, who can introduce one network to another, who can facilitate relationships that would otherwise never exist. And once you start to see it this way, certain patterns begin to emerge. Meetings that do not make sense on the surface, connections that seem unlikely, decisions that appear irrational, but are actually aligned with deeper incentives. Because at this level, the game is no longer about nations. It is about coordination, aligning interests across different systems, creating opportunities within crises, and extracting value from instability. Take geopolitical conflict. On the surface, it is destruction, chaos, uncertainty. But within that chaos, there are opportunities, reconstruction, resource access, financial flows, entire regions reshaped. And for those positioned correctly, these moments are not just risks, they are leverage. This is why certain actors appear again and again around major events, not necessarily causing them, but operating within them, positioning themselves, preparing for what comes next. And this is not limited to one individual, it is a network, a pattern of behavior, a way of interacting with the world where crisis is not avoided but utilized. And once you understand this, the idea of power begins to shift. It is no longer about who leads a country, but who can move between systems, who can influence outcomes without appearing to do so, who can operate in the space between visibility and invisibility. And this brings us back to the core tension, because there is a growing divide, not just between nations, but within the system itself, between those who benefit from the current structure and those who want to reshape it, a conflict not always visible, but increasingly present, a kind of internal fracture where competing interests begin to collide. And when that happens, information starts to leak, stories begin to surface, not necessarily as acts of transparency, but as symptoms of conflict, signals that something beneath the surface is shifting, because when power structures compete, they expose each other, not intentionally, but inevitably. And this is where the system becomes unstable, not because of external pressure, but because of internal tension, a struggle over who controls the mechanism, who defines the rules, who shapes the next version of reality. And once that struggle begins, it does not stay hidden for long. It spills outward into politics, into media, into global events, and eventually into conflict. Because when competing visions of power collide, they do not resolve quietly, they escalate. And what we see on the surface, wars, crises. Instability is often just the visible layer of a much deeper transformation, one that is still unfolding, one that will determine not just who holds power, but what reality itself looks like moving forward. So now we return to the original questions. Why did this war begin? How will it end? And what happens after? Because once you step back and see the full structure, the answers begin to shift. This war did not begin because of a single event. It did not begin with one decision or one mistake. It began because the system reached a point where it could no longer remain stable. The illusion had to be defended. For decades, the global order functioned because people believed in it. They believed in its rules, its fairness, its permanence. But that belief has been weakening, slowly at first, then more rapidly as contradictions became harder to ignore, as inequalities became more visible, as alternative systems began to emerge. And once that happens, the system faces a choice: adapt or reinforce itself. And historically, it chooses reinforcement because adaptation risks losing control. Reinforcement preserves it, even if only temporarily. This is why conflicts escalate. Not because they are always strategically necessary, but because they are symbolically necessary. They send a message. The system is still intact. The structure still holds. The illusion is still real. So why did this war begin? Because the system needed to prove it could still enforce its reality. Now, the second question, how does this war end? Not with a clear victory, not with a simple agreement, because the conflict is not just physical, it is structural. As long as the underlying system remains intact, the tension remains. And as long as the tension remains, the conflict continues in different forms. So the war does not truly end on the battlefield. It ends when the structure itself changes, when the global system that holds everything together begins to fracture, and that leads to the final question: what happens after? Because if the current system weakens, it does not simply disappear. It transforms. Power does not vanish. It reorganizes. New structures emerge. New centers of influence, new rules, new realities. Instead of one dominant system, you begin to see multiple spheres, regions operating under different logics, different alliances, different economic frameworks, a more fragmented world, less unified, less predictable, but also more open to change. And this is where the future becomes uncertain, because when a single shared reality dissolves, it creates space for new systems, new ideas, new forms of power, but also new conflicts. Because competing realities do not coexist easily. They collide, they compete, they try to replace one another, and this is the phase the world is entering. Not the end of conflict, but the transition into a new kind of conflict. One that is less about territory and more about systems. Less about weapons and more about perception. Less about control and more about defining what is real. So when you look at this war, do not just see it as a geopolitical event. See it as a signal, a sign that the current system is under pressure, that the illusion is being tested, that the structure of reality itself is shifting. Because in the end, the most important battle is not the one happening on the ground. It is the one happening in the minds of billions of people, and whichever version of reality they choose to believe, that is the one that will shape the future.